Hi guys, welcome everybody to our New Alternatives event. Here we have Kate Bernhardt, Rachel Lena, and Satiris Georgakopoulos, and we're going to be talking a little bit about homelessness in New York City. New Alternatives is an organization in New York City that assists LGBTQ plus the young people ages 16 to 30, and it's an organization dedicated to the care and well-being of these young people. And it's at the forefront of combating the epidemic of poverty and homelessness in New York City's LGBTQ youth population. They aim to provide all youth who come to them for support with the tools and resources that they need to survive and thrive. And the first person I'm going to be introducing today is Kate Bernhardt. Kate is a longtime AIDS activist and a member of ACT Up New York. Kate has been arrested multiple times for acts of civil disobedience, aka good trouble. And since 2001, she has worked with homeless LGBTQ youth. She spent 5 years serving as the director of Sylvia's Place, which is an emergency shelter for LGBT homeless youth. And currently, Kate is the executive director of New Alternatives for LGBTQ plus homeless youth. So I'll hand it over to Kate.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I know it's a rainy afternoon, so we'll try and get some energy going. So New Alternatives is an organization that we started in 2008 because we noticed that there was some gaps in the available services for this population. Working at Sylvia's Place, I kept seeing clients whose case management was tied to their housing. And so what would happen is, because a lot of housing is time limited, people would have to start over with their case management every time they moved from program to program. And, that's just not a good way to get things done. And it's especially not a good way to develop the trusting relationships that are necessary to get into some of the deeper issues that people who are homeless are dealing with, whether that's mental health or substance. People need to be able to really have a long-term trusting relationship with a stable adult before they're able to address those things. Plus, as I've gone through my career, the processes that people who are homeless have to deal with, whether it's applying for housing or disability benefits, or even just getting your birth certificate, these things are taking longer and longer. And so if you're in a 90-day program, you're not going to get anything accomplished in those 90 days, really. And so you need to be able to have long-term case management just to see those things through. So it doesn't really make sense to start them and then drop them all and then go to another program and then start them again. So that was kind of the thinking behind New Alternatives. And also, we take a pretty activist approach to case management. We see it as kind of clearing away the obstacles that prevent people from being able to move forward in their lives. Whereas think of it as, my dad's from Gloucester, Massachusetts, and we have a house kind of with a lot of forest behind it, the house my dad grew up in. And he would take me out, and there are paths, and every year he would cut the things that out of the way of the paths, the new growth and the trees that have fallen and stuff. So I always think of that, and I think of clearing these paths for the clients to get through. And in many ways, I think of it as using my own privilege. I don't have huge amounts of privilege, but I'm a white educated woman, and I can use that on behalf of the clients to help them get through some of the bullshit they face. Excuse the language. At least you're not high school students, right? So, that's the work we do. And we provide a lot of different services. Over the years, the organization has grown sort of organically as we've seen different needs, and then we've kind of tried to morph and fit them. So we have, we do a lot of work with HIV positive youth. About a third of our clients have HIV or AIDS. We also do we have HIV and STD testing on site. Normally we have an HIV support group for the positive youth, but we can't run groups right now because of COVID. But we have an on-site therapist if we ever get the money, we'd love to have an on-site psych person, either a nurse practitioner, probably can't afford an MD. In the winter, we sometimes stay open all night so that people don't freeze on the street if they don't have anywhere to go. We have meals. During COVID, we've taken to handing out meals 6 days a week. We bring in clothing, all kinds of things, whatever we can assist with. And case management runs the gamut from helping people with immigration cases to helping people with criminal cases to helping people find housing to helping with medical issues and benefits and education and employment and all that stuff. So it's a lot of things. And what we're seeing though in the city is homelessness has continued to increase throughout my career. And we're now probably, the city counts 80,000 people in the New York City shelter system. And that doesn't include the youth shelters. It doesn't include several other types of private shelters. So you're probably really including people on the street and in the psych wards and in prison and all the homeless folks in the city. You're probably talking about 100,000 people, which is a lot of people. And New York City is, of course, a mecca for queer youth from all over, especially people who are like east of the middle of the country. If they're west of the middle of the country, they tend to migrate to San Francisco. But because queer youth don't feel safe, especially in some of the red states, they tend to migrate here, and then they don't realize that it's going to be as difficult as it is, and they frequently wind up homeless. So we have our local kids, a lot of whom we have folks who get kicked out here in New York, but we also have kids who are aging out of the foster care system and becoming homeless. And then we have the influx of young people from other places. So that together creates a pretty substantial number of LGBTQ, et cetera, young people in need of services. And it's definitely a growing population. And what's happened too is that as the price of housing has gone so high, it's a bubble. So people are entering the system constantly, right? Flooding in. And then you have a very, very little outflow into actual housing. And you have this like constantly expanding bubble of folks who are in temporary housing of some sort or on the street. And so this is obviously not a sustainable situation. And, we're really hoping that the next mayor, because we've given up on the one we have, that the next mayor is somebody who takes this seriously. And we're hoping that folks who can vote look at the candidates with an eye. Unfortunately, the person I was most confident about on these issues already dropped out, which is Carlos Menchaca, my friend. But Diane Morales is also pretty good on these issues. There's a few folks. So, but it's really important, I think, that people look at the candidates with an eye towards their housing and homelessness policies, not just homelessness, but also towards affordable housing for the low income people, because what we have right now, they call affordable housing, is a total joke. So, twisted kind of joke, but yeah. So we're only going to prevent people from flowing into homelessness if they can afford to stay in the housing, right, that they have. So it's really important that things like rent control and we don't need to keep building luxury apartments. We need to take some of those back and create housing for people. Things like that are really important policy-wise. And then also there's some current political battles that folks can get involved in if you're interested. There's been an ongoing effort to get the city council to increase the amount of housing vouchers, the actual price, because right now they're handing out these vouchers to shelter residents, but they might as well be monopoly money. You can't use them for anything. Each voucher for one person, it's worth $1,265. And that's just not, doesn't mesh with today's rents. It's just not enough. And especially since there's a lot of discrimination on the part of landlords, So it has to be enough, those vouchers have to be enough money to overcome the discrimination and the hesitancy of landlords to tempt them, right? And right now they're just not at all there. And that also goes for the vouchers in the HIV/AIDS housing system, because right now New York City has a rule that says that anyone with HIV who presents to the system has to be housed the same day. But they're putting them in these crappy emergency placements. They're really, some of them, horrible. And but there's no way out because the HIV/AIDS apartment vouchers are also not enough money. So I was just pausing to see if anybody had any questions at this point.
I actually did have a question. I know we are going to do a Q&A at the end, but about what you were just speaking about with the housing vouchers, is there a separate housing voucher for youth experiencing homelessness or people experiencing homelessness with AIDS or HIV?
Yeah, there are two different voucher systems. There's one called City FEPS, which is they rolled most of the voucher programs into that one. And then there's a separate voucher in the HIV/AIDS administration. It's because they're two separate arms of the government, both part of the HRA, which is the overall welfare system, who they're in charge of. HRA is a lot of branches, right? Everything from welfare to child protection to all this stuff is all under there. But one is also the Department of Homeless Services is under there. But the HIV/AIDS administration is also under there, and they're two separate arms. So that's why the separate vouchers.
Okay. And then is that an indicator? So if you have HIV and AIDS and you're experiencing homelessness, will landlords know that about you because of the type of voucher that you receive?
They might, if they're clued in enough to know the difference, which some might. Some they try to sort of, I mean, they don't print it on, you know what I mean? But they try to keep it low key, but someone who had a real good understanding of the system could probably figure that out.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's problematic. On the other hand, the HIV/AIDS vouchers are more. So not a lot, but sorry, we have they're handing out meals downstairs, so we may get some doorbell ringing. The other problem we have with the other political situation we're dealing with is that right now, because of COVID, a lot of homeless people have been placed in hotels. And that, they did this to de-densify, to lower the crowding in the shelters. And that was a good thing. They did it way too late. They let COVID totally rampage through the shelters. We know of at least 80 homeless people who have died in city shelters because they contracted COVID, and a lot more have been sick. But eventually they did move people into these hotels. But the problem is that there is no plan. So the city has no idea when they're going to declare that it's safe. There's no, they haven't chosen an endpoint for this, right? They haven't decided on a marker which will say, okay, COVID is under control enough that we can end this hotel program. But the other thing is they haven't made a plan for what they're going to do with all these people when they start ending the hotel program. So that's going to be a giant mess, and they should be planning for it now, and everybody is just sticking their head in the sand. So by and large, the hotel program has been actually better than the shelters because it's just they're higher quality facilities. But at a certain point, as tourists start to come back into the city, the hotels are going to start to want to charge, tourist rates as opposed to, they're getting the bottom of the barrel rates from the city, but the hotels would not have been able to stay open if the city wasn't placing people in them. So it was kind of worked for both sides for a while, but at a certain point, it's going to stop working. The city is in no way prepared for that. So, back to the young people, what we're looking at is, first of all, not enough shelter beds that are designated for young people at all, but especially for LGBTQ youth. And so what happens is that, you know, almost every day people call here looking for beds. We don't operate a shelter, we just operate a drop-in center at, at the moment. That may change, but and sometimes there really aren't any available beds for them, especially, we fought for more than 10 years to get the city to increase the age for young people up to age 24. It had previously ended at 21. And we were saying, that's kind of young. Like a lot of people in this day and age aren't ready to fly on their own at 21, especially if they've had a lot of obstacles in their lives. And so what we won that, but then the city never added money to the runaway and homeless youth budget to create shelter beds for the 21 to 24-year-olds. So it almost, was an empty victory because the only folks with beds for the 21 to 24-year-olds are the privately run shelters that, like Sylvia's place, that don't have any government funding anyway. So, but they're very obviously small. I mean, Sylvia's is 12 beds, they can push it. Sometimes if I have somebody who's in a really bad situation, the woman running it now is someone I hired. So I can twist her arm a little and she'll go up to 13 or 14 if she, but they really run out of room. And most of the private shelters are in the same, size range. So there's really a shortage of beds for those young adults. And I think that's kind of the next horizon for advocates to really get more funding for beds for the 21 to 24-year-olds. And also, then the next question is, okay, so you can get people into shelter, but you don't want people sitting in shelters forever. So then the next issue becomes really transitional housing, because it's a little hard to go from a shelter to just independence, even if you had the money, and because people just don't know things like how to manage a place. I mean, that's normal for many young people coming along the first time, but if you don't have parents and family that you can call, it can get pretty out of hand. So that's where transitional housing comes in. And we definitely also need to push for more of that. So still a lot of work to be done.
Thank you, Kate. And definitely I will open this back up to questions at the end for any of you guys, if you want to drop them in the chat and save them so you remember them, or if you just want to ask them later on. Either one works extremely well. And now I'm going to open it up to Rachelina and Satiris Georgakopoulos. First, I'm going to open it up to Rachel. Rachel is a senior at Fordham Rose Hill, studying sociology, philosophy, and bioethics. She has led Go Mississippi and currently is leading Go Chicago. And after graduating in May, Rachel plans to attend St. John's School of Law, and she will be pursuing a career in public interest law.
Hi, thank you so much everyone for coming. Apologize if you can hear my mom coughing or my dog in the back. They don't really, dogs don't care about being quiet, so I don't blame him. He's just doing his thing. So I'm currently leading the Go Chicago trip, which is focused on fighting homophobia and transphobia through an anti-racism lens, specifically in Chicago. So because of that, we're working with the Brother Darce Center, which has been working for many years now as a place for activism and education on homelessness in LGBTQ youth, incrimination rates for people of color who are also part of the LGBTQ community, and how that affects them, specifically trans people of color in Chicago who are placed in prisons that don't match their gender identity and are also given extremely lengthy sentences that don't match their crime. and sort of cruel and unusual punishments that also don't match their crime, which is seen to be kind of based around their gender identity and gender expression as trans people of color. So through this project, we've been working a lot through Brother Darst with various organizations. The first is Brave Space Alliance in Chicago, which is a Black and trans-led alliance in Chicago that's working to fight against police brutality, homelessness, gender pay gaps based on not only gender, but also sexual orientation and race. We have also spoken with Lighthouse Chicago, and we had a wonderful woman, Morgan Sherm, come speak to us, who does a lot of work within the trans community to try and fight for more equality, specifically for POC trans women, because as we're all probably aware or should be aware, the death rates and suicide rates and police brutality rates against POC trans women are astronomically high and are not at all in proportion with the rates for any other group. So Lighthouse Foundation works to fight against that. We discussed dismantling the gender binary as a way to get around gender-based violence, which is a massive reason why LGBTQ youth do end up homeless or without homes. We fight against, or we'll read about fighting against tactics that the US government has used to undermine transformative approaches and instead has attempted to politicize and tone down their approaches, such as scapegoating, the myth that violence and discrimination are based only around bad individuals instead of harmful and oppressive systems, and also undermining transformative organizing by giving small little bites of what we're looking for, which in turn satiate people for a little while, but don't actually fix that underlying cause. So for example, when gay marriage was legalized, everyone says, oh, the fight for gay rights is over. It's like, no, it isn't. Like, there's still so much more work to be done. And a lot of people outside of this community can see this as, oh, this is what you've wanted this whole time. You should be happy now. You should be satiated. And it's like, no, the underlying causes of increased suicide rates in youth and adults in the LGBTQ community are still skyrocketing. Gender and pay gap based on gender or sexual orientation is still skyrocketing. Violence against people within this community is still skyrocketing. So these small scale victories, while they're wonderful, aren't the end goal, and we're still not there yet. So for Go Chicago, we're just looking to see not only how can this be, worked into boots on the ground work in Chicago, but also how can we bring it back here to Fordham? How can we bring it to the Bronx, New York City as a whole, the US as a whole, globally? And while we know that the 10 of us on this team are not going to be able to, make active global change right now, we can make the steps to have some sustainable outcomes at Fordham, because that's where it has to start. It has to start in your own home communities before you can expect it to go globally. It just has to start at home. So that's just a little bit about my trip.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you for coming and speaking today about your project. Next, I'm going to be opening it up to Satiris Georgikopoulos. Satiris is a senior at Fordham College at Rose Hill as well. He is currently leading the Go New York-based Housing Insecurity and Homelessness Project, which is a hybrid project, so partially in person, partially virtual. And he has past experience with Go through his participation in Go New York City during his sophomore year at Fordham. So, Satiris.
Thank you so much. And also thank you all for having me here tonight. So, yeah, like was said, I'm Satiris. I'm currently leading the New York-based Housing Insecurity and Homelessness Project, which has occupied a fairly interesting space this past semester, given that other than our other New York-based project, which is partnered with the Bronx is Blooming, it's the only real attempt, or the only attempted hybrid global outreach engagement currently going on with the Center for Community Engaged Learning, which has posed special challenges, considerations, points of learning and interest, and places that myself and my team have found to be promising going forward. So just a bit about what we've done, what we cover, and also where we're going. Our weekly meetings are on Zoom on Wednesdays, and we usually, at least for the first half or so of the project, was trying to get a more complete understanding of the situation in New York City concerning housing insecurity and homelessness, as well as how the outbreak of COVID-19 has affected it. That was a very particular point of interest for the project, as well as something that we would have to keep in mind for our in-person engagements, because that framed basically every single step of our going forward into these communities. So it began as a very catch-all sort of project. When looking at housing insecurity and homelessness, we looked at historical context of housing insecurity and inequities in different neighborhoods and boroughs in New York City. So one of our first points of entry was, for example, the epidemic of fires in the Bronx in the 1970s, and the structural, failures that led to that, and also the notion or phenomenon of invisibility of certain neighborhoods or of certain individuals in the kind of mainstream consciousness, that especially when working in any capacity with housing insecurity or with homelessness, is something that I have come to realize like it needs to be consistently combated against and unlearned. I grew up in the suburbs outside of New York City on Long Island. There are certain, political and cultural blind spots that often come with that. And even though I have found myself in a leadership position, I am still very much towards the beginning of this journey of growth. We've worked with the Department of Homeless Services at the 30th Street Men's Shelter. That was our first in-person engagement. We were assisting with, administering of lunches, and also we helped with organizing certain areas, specifically the clothing donation room. Pretty old-fashioned go engagement right there. We recently wrapped up a project with the Bronx Community Board 6 in having a beginning of the month food drive. So we were having donations throughout the month of March, and then myself and two other team members went over to the community board building and helped with the giving away and the distribution. And then we have a scheduled next engagement with the Highbridge Community Development Corporation, which is a group that runs and owns multiple middle and low income housing units in the Bronx, as well as housing is particularly for the elderly. And at the moment, they're in the works with Fordham University of administering a needs-based survey that will go forward to inform, decisions that will reflect how they try to pursue policy changes in the city. Given that we are not the most qualified people to actually administer a survey, we're going to be helping with outreach and getting the word out in preparation for that. We have had the chance to speak with many wonderful individuals with multiple different perspectives. We spoke with a former Fordham alum working at the, long title, so I wrote it down just to be safe. It was the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, New York City office. We've had chances to attend we attended a community board meeting, all very just as far as sustainable outcomes or sustainable, goals for students, for myself, for Fordham, just kind of trying to normalize a more consistent engagement and trying to fight back against the very easy reflex of kind of just falling back into, your normal day-to-day path of least resistance where you're not really thinking about these things. And these things, can be work to think about. They can be particularly uncomfortable, especially in the beginning. And that's something we've had to grapple with. And also because of this, new frontier of, hybrid engagement, trying to get this stuff done during the pandemic, we've also experimented with, less traditional forms of engagement. For example, the food drive, that was something we felt went very well, and we would like to see kind of kept in mind for the future, in addition to traditional engagements, some like longer form projects, which, not to say we pioneered this, like that's just not the case, but just something that we saw as a particularly useful way to kind of mold that sustainable, consistent engagement in students. Hopefully that will stay within them going forward in the semesters and many years to come. I think I've rambled enough. So yeah, thank you so much for listening to me and letting me talk a bit about my project.
Thank you so much, Satiris. So that concludes the speaker portion of the event for tonight. Now I want to open it up to questions for anybody. So if anybody has any questions that they want to drop in the chat, or if you want to private message me, I can ask them out loud anonymously, or you can unmute yourself and ask our speakers directly. So I'll give you guys a couple seconds to think of questions, and then we can get started with that.
I have a question. I don't know if this is going to be eloquent, but I was just thinking about, Kate, it was interesting that you mentioned the situation with like putting, like using hotels as shelters temporarily, because I do remember like seeing posts on like Upper West Side blogs and things like that, and people in the neighborhood were like so angry about this. And like, I don't know, I was just wondering, especially like being at Fordham and Lincoln Center, and we're here in Manhattan, which is Upper West Side, I guess, like largely the privileged area, like what we could do, to get people to be more aware and like how to advocate for, like, I don't know if in this area specifically it was like homeless youth, or maybe it was just the population in general, but just to get people thinking about it more and more aware, because it was kind of shocking. I remember seeing people were that angry because it's like, wouldn't they rather have people getting the shelter they need? So yeah.
The politics around the hotel program have been, and in fact, just around locating shelters, building new shelters, can get really, really ugly. Especially the Upper East Side and the Upper West Side both, had these major battles about hotels being used as shelters. And, it's funny because those are the same people that complain about street homeless people. And it's like, well, if you don't want them on the street, then there has to be somewhere for them to be indoors, right? So, and there are advocacy groups that have been working on this particular issue in both communities to try to get folks to be more understanding of. And also, I mean, at one point they hired a very politically, the wealthy residents hired a very politically connected lawyer to try to stop the hotel shelters as well. So, but there are definitely local groups organizing. I know there, a lot of what they've been trying to do is trying to help people sort of understand that homeless people are just people, which you would think should be obvious, but not so much to very rich people who don't get that many Americans are 1 or 2 paychecks away from homelessness. And certainly when the pandemic eviction bans go away, there's going to be a massive wave of evictions unless policy-wise the government does something to prevent that. So the fact that people act as though, you know, homelessness is such a foreign thing, for most Americans, it's actually not that far off. But of course, for people living on the Upper West Side, it is more far off. And so I think there were just definitely efforts to humanize, and those were that's the adult homeless system, but still, that's mostly what's been going on. And also some political organizing to, you know, keep sort of counter pressure the city council representatives of those areas to make sure that they understand that those voices are not the whole population of those communities. So that's that. But it's been pretty ugly.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I definitely was interested in that back when that was going on. And so thank you for providing more of a like context around that. And then I guess this is like a random question, but you would also mention that there was something called, they were calling portable housing, but it wasn't actually like effective. What are they considering portable housing? What is that?
Well, the way affordable housing works is they go by the medium income of the surrounding area to set the rents. So the medium income in an area like, say, the Upper West Side or Gramercy or something is really, really high. And so then if you base the rents on that medium income, you're talking about, I know at Stuytown, it became $80,000. Well, that's, you know, that's the income they set minimum income requirements for the affordable housing. And if that's your minimum income, that's not, I couldn't get in there, like I'd have to make maybe like almost twice as much as I make. So, most it's just ridiculous. That's not affordable. And even in very, rather low income communities that are gentrifying, the gentrifiers' income have pushed up the AMI and what's happening is, so those affordable apartments are in usually sort of buildings, these luxury buildings that are going up as part of gentrification or hyper gentrification. And so a certain number of apartments have to get set aside in a deal with the city for affordable housing, and they go into the housing lottery. First of all, the lotteries are ridiculous in terms of the number of people who are in the lottery and the chances of actually succeeding. But the other thing is that they do set these minimum incomes. And then also the developers have tried to do things to sort of separate out the affordable housing tenants, like the so-called pour doors, where they were putting in separate entrances for the affordable housing tenants. So it's quite problematic in many ways. And in return, they're getting tax credits from the city. That's the other thing, in return for creating this bullshit affordable housing.
Thank you. Wow, I had no idea that there was even a minimum to qualify for affordable housing. That doesn't really make, that's incredible that that's even a thing. I did have another question, just for Fordham students and anybody on this call. Are there currently any ways that we can get involved with New Alternatives on their website? On the website, there's a page for volunteers. Is that active right now during COVID? Or even outside of New Alternatives, if you know of any where we can just stay engaged with this issue and really work to making this better as individuals as much as we can do?
There are not a lot of in-person volunteering opportunities here right now. We're trying to keep the numbers of folks in the building relatively low. They seem to be creeping up, but we do, if you join the volunteer list, as things come up, we do send out emails, and sometimes they're one-offs, or, we need some hands to help a client move, or client found a stray kitten, can anybody take it, kind of thing, because too many of them wound up at my house already. And so, we try to relocate the spare cats and things like that. But also, and then some things can be done online. Sometimes we have requests for tutors or things like that are more amenable to doing online. The other thing I would do is follow the homeless can't stay home hashtag, because that is a political group organizing around the voucher prices and the hotels and some of the other political issues around homelessness right now. So they're a good, and they've been having actual, like rallies and stuff. They could use more people to come out, because it's a mostly homeless folks who are involved in the group, and a few advocates. So they could use some more like broader support. And they also, the other folks who are working on these issues, Vocal New York, VOCAL, they're based in Brooklyn. They do a lot of work around issues, political work around issues affecting like poverty and homelessness, and also some other things like, injection drug use and things like that. So they're a really good organization to follow, and they're always at City Hall raising hell. So
Thank you so much. I dropped the link to the Twitter hashtag homeless can't stay home and Vocal New York both in the chat for everybody who wants to check those out. I also had another question for Satiris, actually, about your project. I know you spoke a bit about the Bronx fires in the 70s. Could you explain maybe a bit more about that to the people who are here in this call, and how you would maybe connect that to some of the issues that we're still seeing today and we're still working towards solving, especially in New York?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So for those who don't know, for a decent chunk of the 70s, stories were kind of all over the news about fires in the Bronx, and at times they got pretty expansive, ranging from the South Bronx all the way up to almost here around Fordham Road. And it became a breeding ground for very insidious and quite problematic, political narrative that honestly still holds sway in the minds of some today. And that is that these neighborhoods, they're burning up, they're dangerous because the people there don't care about these neighborhoods, which, I mean, I'm confident that I don't need to like communicate why that's absurd to you guys, just because, nobody wants to burn their house down. That was another big allegation, was that these were all caused by, either like, hooligans, big quotes around that, or, like these were like purposeful fires. And in some cases there were issues with landlords and things like that. But another common issue that exacerbated this was the state of the housing and the state of the electrical wirings and appliances. These buildings were often very old. Landlords many times did not take great care of these buildings. Also, budget cuts and poor, financial situations in New York City at the time led to cuts to the fire department, particularly in lower income neighborhoods, which were the neighborhoods that were facing these problems the most. You did not see closures of firehouses in neighborhoods that had low fire risks that were higher, income. And this connects now to the bigger, or not bigger, but like connects to the issue of, the de facto segregation of cities like New York, and how that's still the case today, and how it has these roots that go back for generations. If you look at a map of New York City now, broken down by, identification with racial groups, New York City is still very clearly demarcated between groups. The Bronx has a high level of people of Hispanic origin and African American origin. Many neighborhoods in Manhattan are predominantly white. One of like the noticeable exceptions to this rule is Jackson Heights, often called like the most diverse neighborhood in the United States. I would recommend going there. It's actually like it's Roosevelt Avenue is a great place, and this has roots in the practices of redlining, of predatory lending, which both grew out of and exacerbated generational wealth gaps that often existed along racial lines, that that have now cemented the fact that lower income communities facing higher levels of housing insecurity, are disproportionately communities that are predominantly made up of people of color. And once you bring COVID into that, COVID has increased the amount of people in New York City experiencing severe rent burden. So people who are spending more than 50% of their paychecks towards paying their rent. And if you were to look at different studies that break down neighborhoods by how many people are severely rent burdened at the moment, these neighborhoods disproportionately exist in the Bronx and in Brooklyn, and are disproportionately people of color. So again, we see these very long running systemic issues of wealth gaps and, like this, segregation of neighborhoods within New York City, then getting compounded on further by the pandemic. So I don't know if I answered all of your question to a satisfactory amount, but please let me know.
No, absolutely. Thank you. I think that that's really important for us to realize that this is a long-standing issue and not something that's just really come up in the past couple of years, even though it might seem more apparent now as we're getting a bit older and learning a little bit more about these issues. For Rachel, I also had a question for you about your project. I know your project is still in progress, but you mentioned that you want to kind of bring it home to Fordham and really work on improving it in the ways that your team can. What are some of the areas of improvement that you've noted in the Fordham community or in New York in general that you think that we could work on as individuals or as Fordham students or as New Yorkers or anything like that?
Yeah, so everyone besides me on the team, because I'm graduating, is still going to be at Fordham next year, which is really great because Fordham is going fully in person, which kind of allows them to practice, I guess, what we're preaching here. And it's not just going to go away when we all separate to wherever we live normally. So a couple of the things that we speak about a lot, actually, and we notice is the way that, this kind of soft racism occurs on Fordham's campuses and isn't really addressed the way that, there isn't a lot of representation for people of color or LGBTQ students or multicultural students on campus. We speak a lot about and want to address that divide that we have, especially at Rose Hill, where, if you're on campus within the gates and then you step out onto the gates onto East Fordham Road, how big that divide is and how it is all so separate. and you literally have like a wall separating Fordham students from the community that they've come in, and whether or not they like it, have begun to gentrify and have begun to make life harder for Bronx natives and Bronx residents who aren't Fordham students. So ways we're trying to look at that is just, how can we avoid impacting, or how can we, because you can't avoid it, it's just unavoidable, but how can you limit your negative impact and influence in the community as a whole? How can you, in times of COVID, protect the native Bronx residents? Does that include not going out without masks on? Does that include limiting your time, not taking COVID guidelines seriously? And then how can you avoid gentrification within the Bronx? How can you, support small businesses within the Bronx? And we talked about, a big thing I think for Fordham students is going into Manhattan for, why do I say it like that? Going into Manhattan for brunch or lunch, when there are so many fabulous restaurants, not including Arthur Avenue. There are so many fabulous restaurants in the Bronx run by real people, family restaurants, small businesses. How can you go out and how can you encourage your friends to go out and support those businesses to maybe, help someone make their living and contribute to this intermingling and positive relationships between Fordham students and people who live in the Bronx just as their normal life? They aren't Fordham students. These are people, this is their home, this is their neighborhood, this is where they grew up, where they're raising their children. So how can, instead of being a gentrifying presence and, this kind of invader, how can you go in and actually support the community that you have chosen to live in for your 4 years at Fordham? And that's just some ways that we're trying to focus on Fordham as a whole. It's been hard to think of bigger goals than that, because it just all seems so big. It just all seems so hard to accomplish in such a short amount of time, especially when we're doing this all on Zoom. We really are lacking resources, which I'm sure everyone can notice everywhere around is really lacking resources and just time.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. I think part of the work that needs to be done is preventing homelessness, in taking the initiative to really protect your community and build up small businesses and individuals to prevent homelessness in the long run. And so definitely working on having a positive relationship with the Bronx community and the New York City community as a whole as Fordham students is going to be increasingly important as we move forward. I know we only have a few minutes left, so I just wanted to say a couple of reminders. The Fordham fundraiser is still going on until mid-April, and so if you guys want to bring anything in to Fordham, our box is in 217. We've already received a few donations, and we have some of our own going into it, and so we're really excited for that. And so if you guys are able, please stop by in 217. Oh, it's actually in McMahon now, in the McMahon lobby. Sorry, I forgot that we moved it. And then I also had a couple of announcements just to throw in here. So we have our alumni panel April 21st at 8 p.m. Our leader applications for summer projects close April 23rd. And our participant app for summer projects is closing May 3rd. And yes, like Ali said, you can head to the list of New Alternatives approved items on the Fordham Go LC Instagram. And that's all that we have today. Thank you so much to our great speakers, our incredible speakers, Kate, Rachel, and Satiris. Thank you guys so much for your time and your effort and for really coming and speaking to us so sincerely and really providing us with a lot of information. So thank you guys so much. And yeah, everybody have a great night.